All right, good morning, everyone. This is David D'Arcangelo with Susquehanna Energy Products here outside of Philadelphia for today's weekly seasonal or subseasonal forecast discussion. And I'm glad to be here today. I know I did this a month ago, and I try to hop on as much as much as I can during the Tuesday sessions. But glad to be able to be in the driver's seat a little bit. So the forecast period we're talking about today were for forecasts made on the 16th of March, verifying from March 31 to April 4. The map I'm showing here is the verification. We'll look at the hard numbers here in a minute, but this is the verification for that period. It was fairly classically warm west, cold east look. In terms of a ridge trough pattern, we had cold centered really across the southern Appalachians and most of the southeast. And then warmth extending from the upper Midwest, particularly across the northern Rockies, and then throughout much of the West Coast. There's some things I'm going to touch on, though, with regards to this. One is that we get a lot of latitude, or I like to call it kind of a very wide strike zone when it comes to these springtime forecasts. When I looked at the verification, I thought, well, the numbers are going to be pretty ugly when it comes to this. But fortunately, when we get to this time of year, HDDs are getting very limited to almost non-existent in the South, particularly Florida, the Gulf Coast area, and Texas. So a quote unquote cold look there really isn't adding much in HDD territory. And fortunately, a lot of this cold was centered away from the major population centers like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. So we got a little bit of a benefit of the doubt there. So the numbers weren't as ugly as I imagined them to be, with most of this cold being centered kind of across the southern Appalachians and southeast. So we get a lot of leeway in the industry this time of year. Some of these quote unquote misses don't really matter all that much from the energy perspective. Imagine if you're in, say, Atlanta, and the average temperature is 60 degrees, and you have a week that verifies, say, 55. You're not really adding much heating demand from that perspective, and really none across Texas. If anything, you may be actually subtracting some very early air conditioning loads across like South Texas, like Houston, Austin, San Antonio. So a cooler week there is actually just really in the temperate category. And then some of the heating that you added in the north was kind of only on the marginal level. So again, a wide strike zone, and we get a pretty wide berth when it comes to these forecasts. So when you look at the numbers of how we added up, the actual number of HDDs this week was 77.5. And then when you look at our CRPS scores, they don't look that great, but I actually didn't think our numbers were all that bad, even though we may not be loving the negative CRPS scores. Consensus ended up being 71.2. Everyone was leaning a bit to the warmer side for most of these forecasts. I didn't see really anybody out there that was kind of at or above the verification number. And I think that the reason being, most people were not expecting it to be as sharply cold as it was. Sometimes I like to think of, I like to roll back and say, what were we thinking when we made these forecasts? And one simple way to do that is to look at the period we were in going into this cold stretch. So this forecast was made on the 16th of March. So let's look back at the week leading into that. So let's just go from the 9th of March to the 15th. This is what the map was. It was exceptionally warm across all of the eastern half of the country, particularly Texas, the Mississippi Valley, the Great Lakes, and then cold in the west. This was a continuation of a very warm period that had kind of come out of that exceptional cold in mid-February. So I always like to think sometimes we're maybe a little bit biased, particularly in spring and fall. We don't have really strong indices. We don't have a lot to kind of hang our hat on. Sometimes we're a bit biased by what we have been experiencing going into the forecast period. We're forecasting for a 3-week out period, and the visibility on that is not very good. The week going into this forecast, though, was just so warm, and it may have influenced us some to the extent to the warmer side, albeit a lot of the indices, at least in my opinion, and incorrectly so, also lean warm. So let's go back to those verification numbers. The ECMWF was also very warm. You can see 67.7 was what its forecast was. The CFS was actually too cold at 82.8. So it was actually one of the few outliers in there. Its forecast map was this, which was kind of right for the wrong reasons, right? It was showing a fairly large ridge across central Canada and the eastern half of the country, cold in the west. maybe a brief trough or kind of a modest trough over the far Northeast, New York and Boston in particular, it really did not get that pattern right. We had obviously a pattern that was almost flipped that completely, which is warmth in the West and this strong cold in the East. So the question would be, what was driving that? And this is a challenging question. I have been pondering this for a couple of days, knowing that we'd be doing this discussion this morning. So one of the things that I was looking at was, where were we? What happened with some certain indices like the EPO or the MJO? This is the EPO, and this is a 30-day look back here on verification. That's the forecast going forward. And you can see, it's interesting that we've had this kind of on a kind of intra-week time scale, we've had a lot of variability in the EPO signal going back to the third week in March. So we had a very big negative dip, quick move positive, very sharp, another move negative, a very sharp move positive. And then this negative move most recently coincided with the cold period in the eastern half of the country that we just experienced for our verification period. So this is kind of one of those, it's a tough thing to nail down when you have, very much, very inconsistent look from the EPO on this intra-week time scale. It just seems really difficult to me to kind of hit that. The question to me, though, was why was the EPO so volatile? And I don't honestly have a really great explanation of that. We look at the MJO. The MJO has come out of a fairly coherent signal in phases 4 and 5. That actually was fairly well forecast. If you look back at forecasts that were made around mid-March when we were making these predictions for the end of month and early April, the MJO had a look that was going to have a fairly coherent look across Indonesia and maybe the very far Western Pacific. These are very warm phases. Phases 4 and 5 tend to be the warmest phases of MJO all through the year, in particular, also March and April. So a lot of us that were leaning warm, and particularly myself, we were probably leaking like something like an MJO that would be going through warm phases with a bit of a La Nina-ish base state maybe to it. That just didn't work out at all. Dave, I'm going to hand it over to you in a minute because I'd like you to show, if you have a 500 millibar map for this verification period, could you grab that for me real quick? And I'll let you can share your screen to do this.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead. I just don't have one up handy.
You want it right now?
Yeah, can we do that?
Yeah, sure. All right, so let's go to, this is the right forecast, right? This is the forecast made on the 16th.
Correct.
Right, okay. So we'll look at the EC and the CFS. Here's the CFS, and I'll pull up, it's coming. And then where's the EC? EC is down here. We also have the hemispheric view, but this is the global view. So you can see it here. Maybe I'll put them side by side if you want. Is that kind of what you're looking for? Or?
No, I'm looking for verification, Dave.
Oh, verification. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry
Yeah, sure. All right. So this should be it. Global 500.
Oh, perfect. This is great. Yeah. So this is actually interesting and misleading at the same time. There's this move towards a pseudo NAO look with ridging over Greenland. We ended up with that look of that fairly strong ridge in the West, but other things just don't really add up well here, right? There isn't a semblance of a very strong trough in the Eastern United States and Eastern North America. Actually, there's a modest trough that centers for that period over, say, New York, but, the extent of the cold across the East, and particularly the Southeast, isn't well reflected by 500. There's a very large ridge over the Aleutians. That's the marker of a MJO phase 4-5, kind of a La Nina base state. That really showed up well, but in other ways it didn't. And obviously there's a very deep trough in northern Canada, Alaska, and kind of the Arctic adjacent to Alaska. These just aren't great indices. If you show me that 500 millibar map, I'm not drawing a temperature anomaly map to the extent of which we saw. So this is a really tough one here. And I'm glad it's springtime, because had this occurred, say, a month prior, and then throughout most of winter, this would be just a crushing verification. And in reality, it's not really that bad. Again, we get a really lot of latitude, with these kind of mildish spring forecasts. But these are really tough ones to hit, right? We saw the EPO, be very, very volatile in the few weeks leading up to this forecast period, with going positive and negative, in the order of like every 3 or 4 days. Some people like to think that there's this, that the wavelengths get very short and choppy in the springtime. You come out of this, the seasonal jet is breaking down. you're not truly in a, in a mid-spring regime. You've got some leftover residue of wintertime forcings, and it becomes a very messy look. So spring, I think, is a really challenging time frame, for these week 2, week 3 outlooks. And if you look across the mid latitudes, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 if you look over by the date line. 5 troughs kind of bookended by strong ridging to the north, one over the North Pacific that extended to the Aleutians, another one over Greenland. And you've got some of these kind of like cutoff-ish lows running around the mid latitudes, roughly around 40, 35 to 40 degrees north. It becomes a really tough one to gauge. Overall, this has been a really warm pattern. And Dave, I'm gonna share the screen again if that's cool with you.
Sure.
Great. So let me. Right. So, the MJO was misleading. The EPO was really volatile. And we end up with something that just, just is one of those hiccupy 5-day periods. Let me go back and suggest, though, to you that it is still a rather warm pattern, right? If we look at the pattern from, say, that second week in March all the way to this most recent verification, we'll even do it through yesterday. It's a pretty warm look in the eastern half of the country, right? That's the look we saw for the balance of winter up to the early part of February. So, it really hasn't changed. The way I like to communicate some of this is in the energy space to say, it's a predominantly warm forecast with the recognition that you can get these kind of hiccupy 4 and 5 day periods. And it just so happened that this one coincided with our verification window, March 31 to April 4th. So this is a tough one, but I kind of chalk it up as we get a little bit of extra leeway in spring. We also recognize that spring can be a bit more volatile. And then in the larger context, which is from an industry perspective, we like to say it's still a relatively warm leaning pattern, because if we look at the week leading up to that cold, it was mild. We had the cold stretch right during and smack in the middle of our verification. And I think if we're going to look then at the next, say, if we look at the next 7 days, which would be really yesterday through, say, this weekend, we're going to see another very warm look, particularly from Texas to the Great Lakes. So this was just wedged in an overall mild pattern that we've really seen since late February, since the extreme cold in Texas broke. So it feels like a tough one. It's a bit of a gut punch from a map perspective. I don't think our numbers were all that bad. I don't look at these as saying like we're all to the warmer side for the most part, but it wasn't terribly so. In fact, I think a few guys got it actually pretty close. Philip, 74.8. We missed it by 3 degree days. I think that's a solid forecast. A lot of people here in like the low 70s or even the high 60s. Just wasn't end up being that bad, even though our CRPS numbers just don't look very outstanding. I kind of pause here. I want to, if anyone has any comments, questions. I don't think I have a really good explanation for kind of why we get this hiccupy period, other than kind of just springtime noise. But I'll be happy to kind of elaborate on some points, or if you have any questions or comments, this is a good time.
Any questions for Dave? I know I have a question, but I'll wait, see if anyone else wants to jump in. Well, I'll jump in, and then if folks think of something. Dave, I mean, you were, I guess when you were talking about this, this cool period and stuff, and talking about also in the context of a relatively warm pattern, I got to thinking about how, we've had these discussions before, or at least related discussions, but I got to thinking about just more in general, like how it's, especially if you're in the middle of a season, like middle of winter, middle of summer, forecasting, knowing the difference between 2 to 4 weeks out, knowing the difference between maybe a synoptic type change versus a full scale pattern shift that's going to last like something like what we saw in February, or then after February. But and like, hey, it's a 5-day period of cool embedded within a warm period, or oh shoot, we're shifting to like a 4 to 6 week kind of event. And so my question is, because it seems obviously important to know that distinction, i.e., like listen, if you really know for sure, like if you really have high confidence that it's going to, there might be a 5-day period of cool within the warmth, you probably communicate that. You say, hey guys, yeah, there might be a couple, I might miss a synoptic event. I'm going to keep things warm because I feel really, really confident that overall, the month ahead is going to end up warm. And so I'm going to go with the 70% skew, knowing I may miss this blip, but trust me, rely on this and whatever. So my question really is, like, how much research have you done, or is there, do you feel like there's good research in terms of being able to distinguish, out medium, long range in terms of, the kind of event that's short, like a 5 or 7 day blip versus something that's really going to have legs to it?
Sure, sure. I'm still sharing my screen too. Just
Yep.
is that yeah? So great. I just wanted to bring up. This is a Hofmöller of the 200 millibar velocity potential, and I'm gonna try to use this to answer your question. So your question is actually a really good one, which is that how do you differentiate between? Let me restate this, Dave. How do you differentiate between a short-lived, somewhat synoptic event versus a wholesale pattern shift that would last for weeks? Is that right? That's what you're getting at.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a challenging distinction, and it's a very good question without a really good answer. As with so many things in this seasonal, subseasonal space, what are the markers that you would identify? The research is not very conclusive in terms of like what helps you predict larger scale changes. And I'm going to back up a bit. I'll even submit that the February cold, which was really a 3-week cold event in the middle of the continent, that in a sense was a rather short-lived cold event, and maybe not a classic pattern change, but it was a short-lived cold event in an overall broader scheme of mild weather that went back right to last fall and is continuing here into the first half of April. Now, I could get plenty of people argue would say that was a significant pattern shift from the magnitude of it, and I think there's a lot of merit to that, right? When you have 40 and 50 degree anomalies for 7 or 8 days, it's not easy to stand in front of your employer and say, well, it was a short-lived synoptic event. And then obviously you're going to get throat punched with something like that. So I don't have a very good answer, but it's a great question. As with so many things, this gets to be a bit vague. I like to think of it in terms of, are we seeing hemispheric wide markers at either the very high latitudes with regards to certain things like stratospheric warming, or more importantly in the tropics? There's something driving it in the tropics that may suggest a more long-lived pattern change. And so what we're looking at here is what I think is a rather good low-frequency signal out of the tropical Pacific. Everything to the north of this line is verification, going back to the beginning of February. And then south of this line is the forecast from the European ensembles. What we're seeing here is a rather coherent signal, for the most part, that extended kind of from late February with a small break and then reinvigorated the second and third weeks of March across Indonesia, right? This is the reference geographically in the bottom. Those are the MJO phases that they try to differentiate. But what we're seeing here is a very coherent signal across what ends up being phases 4, 5, maybe 6 broadly, right? This is a very big marker of a La Nina-ish base state. There's some hiccups to that, or threads of convection that extend away from that core. But the balance of this is to see a rather coherent signal and a really strong signal going into the end of March across the Indonesia and far western Pacific, right? Those are warm phases. We call them warm phase MJOs. I might use a slightly different term. But my point being, Dave, going back to your question, which is that if I'm seeing something there which would indicate what is potentially a rather large shift, a breakdown of the base state pattern, something that would argue for an actual pattern shift in the mid latitudes, that's kind of the underpinnings of what I'm looking for, right? And I didn't see that when we made this forecast back on the 16th of March, which is about where my cursor is right now. I was staring at forecasts which were warm phase MJOs. And again, as I pointed out, I think when you go from March, through what will end up being roughly the say the 13th or 14th of April, that's going to bear out pretty well, right? That cold period of 5 days is going to get washed out in really what is going to end up being a fairly overwhelming warm signal. Now, going forward, this is maybe a little different, right? So like, let's look out at the end of the time period, which is kind of like down here at the bottom of this graphic, right? We don't have as much coherency with this MJO signal going forward, right? It starts to kind of bleed out. We have some convection which exists over the Indian Ocean, really more East Africa. We have some that starts to exist over South America and Central America. Maybe there's an indication going forward we may be coming out of this warm regime, and this may start to play a role with forecasts, here for the later 3rd of April, maybe potentially in May. Maybe it's a seasonal shift that we're seeing in the MJO signal. We know that from a sea surface perspective, the La Nina is really kind of faded and really kind of broken down. It's challenging to argue that we're truly in La Nina. So I guess what I'm saying, Dave, is I'm looking for big markers, and I usually look towards the tropics for that, right? Is something altering in the tropics to make us think that we could be kind of breaking down the base state. And a lot of times what we do here is we refer to kind of base state weather to give, our customers an idea of, in general, over the course of like weeks to months, what would be predominant weather conditions. So, this winter was a really classically La Nina base state, which had a lot of warm signals associated with it, right? The challenge then becomes, can you pick out the 1 or 2 or 3 week periods that turn cold, similar to the February one, and that's obviously a challenge, but we like to refer to it as kind of a base state condition. And I'm looking for big markers, particularly this time of year in the tropics, which can be indicative of some of those changes, right? So the manifestation of that is to downstream see, like, is it altering the EPO in a significant way? Is it maybe showing up in the NAO? But before it shows up in that, you're likely to see the markers show up in the tropical Pacific. You kind of pick your ingredients of what you want to look at. You could look at it from, just a pure Hofmolar perspective, a Wheeler-Hendon perspective, if you want to just look at MJO outlooks, right? This is the outlook today. And I'm going to throw up the ensembles here. This is the European model. We're in phase 6 fairly strongly now. This is kind of a Western Pacific signal, right? In the MJO is forecast to progress into phases 7 and 8 here on the European ensembles. If I remove that, if I show the GFS shows an expansive MJO signal, a stronger MJO signal into phases 6 and 7. I don't think this is like the best way to diagnose MJO tropical activity from the Indian Ocean across the Pacific. I like to look at like the Hofmolars, in particular, something that's a little bit more low frequency, like the 200 millibar velocity potential. We base some of our MJO analogs on that, not on the Wheeler-Hendon phases here. But nevertheless, I think it shows you that maybe there's something that's potentially changing out there. We're seeing a fairly robust MJO signal. The last time this happened was late January. We all know what happened for those 3 weeks in February. Kind of begs the question, right? It's different, not spring, it's springtime now. It's not middle of winter or kind of the later half of winter. So maybe the impact is different, but there's some hints out here that we are seeing some changes as we're seeing these kind of very coherent MJO signals rotate into what may be colder phases. It's a long answer to your question, Dave. It's a good question. I hope I answered it at least decently, but it's a tough one.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I guess crowd is quiet today. I have a couple more questions while we're waiting. Actually related, I think it's an interesting thing. I feel like, and maybe other folks on the line here might have some information, but it's almost interesting to me that there's not like, obviously, I'm sure there's been a lot of research on these things, and yet I feel like, like where there's like the Paul Cosin book of snowstorms and, signatures that you see with the snowstorms and things like that. I always felt like there could be more with these pattern regimes and such. And again, I'm sure there's research. I just feel like it's never been, I think, as easy to access that, or maybe there's just not something that's more layman's for someone like me. But I don't know how you feel about that, but like, even just like when I think about, just to expand this a little bit, like, and to date myself, like one of the original like big pattern transitions that I remember was in the late 80s with the winter of like 1989, 90, where we had just an unbelievable record breaking cold in some areas in December. And then we went very warm the rest of the year. And then counter would be something like a 2013, 14, which, obviously was very cold and it just never really got out of that. We had synoptic warmings, but never really got out of the cold. Or maybe you throw like a 2009, 10 almost in there and stuff like that. And it's, the distinguishing characteristics, right? And it would be just, if they exist in a cohesive way, like, from even like research folks that have said, yeah, we've looked at these winters that have stayed mostly cold, and this is what we found from, like you said, Dave. And I presume you're probably right. Like, there's going to be some low pass, long term, kind of signals, like maybe a La Nina or this or that. But it would be interesting to sort of catalog that almost as a helpful tool in terms of maybe a diagnostic tool in terms of you know going into a winter and knowing what to look for. Maybe I
Yeah.
don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a good point. We've looked at some of that. The one challenge I think that we all recognize is that some of these large wholesale pattern shifts just don't occur with all that much frequency. You tend to get mired into long-term warmer, cold regimes, and so you end up always feeling like you got a little surprised. Here we are in spring of 2021, and by all accounts, we've been in rather long, warm signal weather regimes going back to, I think, really winter 15. And the reason for that is, we came out of a very, very strong El Nino, and the weather pattern has been supportive of very warm patterns. If all you did was forecast warm for the last 6 years, you merely verifying quite well. You're just missing a couple of fantastically cold, windows in there that, tended to be short-lived, and albeit significant, get washed out in kind of the broader signal. We'll go into another very cold regime. I'm not suggesting that kind of what may happen in late April going into May is part of a larger wholesale multi-seasonal cold regime. And maybe we have to differentiate between those, like you had, say, in winters 13, 14. Those were also very cool summers, the coolest summers of the past decade. So you had a very cold couple of years in what has been a really warm decade, going back to the summer of 2010, or really the winter, like 11, 12 was the first big winter of that warm pattern. These are tough. Those are great questions. I think that feel like a little out of my depth. I do spend a lot of time trying to hit the little ones too. And I don't mean to gloss over this kind of cold 5-day period we just experienced in the East is like, not significant. I mean, it is important, but we get the benefit of the fact that it's in springtime, and, from an energy market perspective, if it's just not all that significant. Nevertheless, I spend a lot of time every day trying to hit those mini cold shots 1 and 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out. So, I feel like there's maybe two bodies of research. One is to kind of hit those synoptic-ish events on a week time scale, because they can be significant. And then one is to try to recognize when you're coming out of like a very long-term warmer cold regime. We're at the, we're in the year 6 of a very warm regime going back to 15, summer 15. And so, those are tough questions, right? Because we recognize that there's been a fairly substantial climate shift, and looking at analogs from the 80s and prior just don't really apply that much, right? The setup isn't quite the same. Even for this extreme Texas cold, there just really wasn't quite good fits for it. And it's just really tough. I hate to throw my hands up and give it kind of that hand wavy argument, but these are tough questions. A lot of times I feel like in my career, you're already kind of in the regime, before you recognize it, and you're like, boy, it's been really cold or hot for the last, 8, 10, 12 weeks. And, well, there you are, you're in a new climate regime. It's just challenging to recognize getting into that. But the winners have been largely the people who forecasting warm since 2011. They've been the victors, even if they've been kind of kicked around by a few very significant cold events. They're overall winning quite well.
Yeah, Speaking of that too, and again, if someone else has a question, jump in because we can change the subject. But I think this is interesting. I know there's been right there's there are there's research that suggests it's not there's maybe not consensus, but there's a research group that thinks that with climate change that we might get because of increased blocking or whatever, we might still get some of these more extreme periods and stuff like that. And again, I know it's a debated, I think, issue. But I guess from your own anecdotal or just what you've seen and what research you've done over the last few years, um, so obviously, like you've made it pretty clear, and the number, it's been warmer in general, right? Especially globally and hemispherically. But have you seen like where areas get? I think I know the answer. I mean, I think maybe you've even said this, but I just want to make sure I was clear. Even when we get those cold periods, so like again, if 80% of the northern hemisphere is warm, but there's 20% that's getting cold, whether it's the United States or Eastern United States, China, whatever, is there a higher persistence that hey, they're going to be in that cold for an extra 2 to 4 weeks, or from your perspective, at least over the last few years, that sample size, are you not only seeing more areas that are more warm than cold, the distribution of warm versus cold changing, but either not seeing the change of the frequency of those events changing, or actually even seeing them actually less duration of cold when it happens.
Yeah, clearly the latter, right? We're seeing shorter duration cold when it exists, even though when it happens, it is still significant in magnitude.
Right.
The underpinnings of persistence just have not been present for cold periods, most notably during the winter months. But in the warmer months, warmer northern hemisphere months, one of the interesting markers of the last couple of decades, notably really the last half decade, has been the lack of extreme heat despite overall above normal temperatures. This is true in the demand centers of the eastern half of the United States. We've seen warm summers been marked by much warmer overnight lows and not excessive daytime temperatures. That's just a peculiarity of maybe what we've noticed since, say, 2012, the last exceptionally hot, high temperature summer. So we've had, I kind of call them grinding above normal temperature summers, which have been marked more by just warm overnight days and temperatures in the, say the Chicago to New York corridor, which are kind of high 80s, low 90s during the day, but warm overnights, exceptionally warm overnights, or really just a large number of overnights, which just don't get cool anymore. When that breaks, I don't know. I don't know if that's part of just a broad climate regime that we're in now. I feel like we're kind of maybe moving very far away from kind of that subseasonal space, getting into some questions of climate. And I should always caveat that by saying I'm not a climate scientist, nor do I look at like hemispheric climate trends for that matter. I'm looking at energy sensitive areas, which obviously geographically tend to be pretty small. And I'm just mostly noting what we're experiencing there, right? A broader climate question, which really should encompass all of the northern hemisphere. I don't think I'm as well skilled to answer. It's certainly out of my depth in terms of signals from that perspective.
Right, but like I still think it's relevant because again, I think some of the work is done by Jennifer Francis, who I think actually has some association with Rutgers. But there's I think it ties in because I think again, I'm not a climate scientist either, but I did sleep at a Holiday Inn Express last night, and in addition to that, no, but I believe right the research is based on the fact that you're going to see more blocking and like AO, NAO type stuff. And of course, that is something folks like you and I use on a regular basis, right? We're constantly paying attention to things like that. The frequency, the duration changes in any kind of shape or form of AO and AO because they're such important signals in the short and medium term and things like that. So that's why I thought just like asking you, just from your visibility as a operational forecaster, are we seeing those changes on the front lines? And for what it's worth, I think again, my answer is kind of similar, that it seemed like for a little while that maybe, again, and I'm sure there's a lot of different ways to calculate blocking beyond just AO. So I'm not trying to say that, our observations refute. I'm just saying these are our observations on the ground, that, there was the winters early, 2010s, late 2009, where it seemed like, oh my God, we're seeing a lot of blocking. But then after that, things actually went in a different direction. And so I think the last time I did this was probably like a year or two ago. So I don't have any recent data. But when I was looking, hey, are there trends in the AO, NAO, things like that over the last 30 or 40 years? I wasn't finding it, at least as of now.
Yeah. Sometimes too that we spend a lot of time like, mired in the data and not recognizing the maybe the broader trend across, multiple seasons. I recall that window was actually 4 consecutive winters in the late 2000s, culminating with the 9-10 winter. And then obviously 10-11 was very cold in the east and southeast as well. By the time you get, into it and you're like, wow, I wonder if we're in a different, climate regime that's cold, it fails you. So that's the kick. That's the kick of kind of seasonal and weather and those timescales. And there was a lot of kind of loose evidence to suggest, well, maybe that's associated with the solar cycle and a very weak solar cycle and leading to more blocking. And while that may felt like an adequate explanation for what we were experiencing at the time, it really wasn't an adequate predictor of kind of what was to come, which was some very warm winters. 11, 12, 12, 13 were 2 really exceptionally warm winters with no snow across all the demand centers in the northern hemisphere. And while you did get a couple of cold winters wedged in there, 13, 14 and 14, 15, it's been one warm slide, one warm snowless slide since then. And it's felt like, and so we get these mini periods of like February 2021, and we're like, wow, it's really cold. But in the broader context, that's just a relative blip in what has been a kind of a decade-long period of warmth. I'm sure there's really good research out there. I feel like sometimes we grasp to explain things that are happening at the subseasonal level and try to make a broader application to that at the seasonal or beyond level. And that's been a bit dangerous, in my experience, doing that, because the things that drive kind of the subseasonal space, which could be a significant MJO event, it could be, in the case of this winter, we had a significant stratospheric event at the end of 2020 and early January 2021. Those kind of things aren't maybe indicative or markers of the broader climate sense. So we misapply, and we do this too at the seasonal level, right? We misapply certain things at certain time scales. That's just one of the challenges of the limited data set that we have to look at. I'm guilty of it as maybe anyone else, is the misapplication on different time scales of different factors, right? Things like NAO, EPO, or even MJO, right? We're misapplying it for the time scale we're trying to predict for, right? It's just a bit of a round peg, square peg, round hole thing, but it's what we have right now. And while it feels it's pretty insufficient, it's also pretty insufficient for everyone else.
Yeah.
It's tough. I think one of the things, since I've been involved in this work with you, Dave, in your class, and looking at the subseasonal space, is it's like you're looking down at a bright light of how challenging this space is, right? We're doing this under very specific rules of making a forecast for a 5-day window. Even if we were to broaden that out and say, let's do a 10 or let's do a 20-day window, right? Let's look at the 10 to 30-day space or something like that. I think we'd be equally humbled by how difficult that is to predict often.
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, with the caveat that, like you said, if you can have some skill in distinguishing between, those full scale pattern changes versus synoptic, then at least you can have some, right? You can provide some helpful guidance, right?
Sure. Absolutely. And this gets into a different question. This is probably a topic for another time, which is that the critical part of, I think, having success in this game is not just trying to get the numbers right, but also communicating it well, and communicating it well across, say, multiple days or weeks, right? That in and of itself has a lot of value. How we communicate it, the numbers we use to communicate it, the tools we use to try to distinguish what is kind of signal from noise. And it's really important as well. So while we have to make this contest very stringent from a rules-based perspective, there's a broader communication part. I think we're trying to get at that with kind of doing some of these like forecast maps across EIA regions. That's helpful, right? Because I think that kind of helps you distinguish kind of like warm versus cold areas of the continent, or something like that, right? The communication piece is really important. And keep in mind, for those who do this like myself in an operational sense, we make this forecast on March 16th, and then we can kind of go to sleep for 3 weeks and we wake up and watch how it verifies. In a real-time sense, you're bombarded with new information every single day to kind of get to that window, right? And that window is constantly moving out. Right now, I'm looking at forecast periods mid to late April or early part of May. And each day there's new chunks of information which come out, which may or may not be relevant at all, to try to communicate that. So this game is, I always feel like, we take a static snapshot, and it's important because it allows us to verify, it allows us to make quantifiable measurements of who did what was quote unquote a good forecast versus not a good forecast. But in reality, the challenge is constant, it is ongoing. That's part of the fun of it as well. I don't mean to make this out to be like some, death march, right? This is fun, right? Each day there's new pieces of information which come out, which you have to try to, use it or find some skill in, or at least discount and try to, try to say that wasn't an important data marker. I think that's what makes this job perhaps the most fun, is each day presents a new challenge with new pieces of information which come out.
Right. And in your seat, just for, for other folks on the line here, it's like, it, it's, it's really challenging because yeah, it's not like you're just making a 16 to 20 day forecast or whatever, or month ahead forecast, right? You're making it for all, in most cases anyway, for like the entire time window from like, day one, maybe sometimes even intraday, and then all the way out to those seasonal forecasts. So it's a battle, right? Between, like you said, like you have to think season ahead, month ahead, week, subseasonal, synoptic, and then how do they all kind of interplay together? Is this a case where the synoptic's going to drive the subseasonal into change? Is this a case where, hey, what's going on in the next 5-10 days is just a minor blip and I should hold on to my seasonal views, which are based on different types of information? I think yeah, I mean, that's one of the challenges, right?
Exactly. That's right. That's very true. And you're also trying to meet your customers' needs. So as much as you might think that it's fashionable to talk about something in the week 3 space, you might have a customer who, whose product that he is trading or she's trading is not important. That is not an important factor for them. So I think it always comes back to like, who are your customers? What are they looking at? What do they find valuable? I try to err on the side maybe of don't bombard them with information, right? They can look at Twitter if they want for just this kind of like, puking of information every day. Can I make the information kind of relevant? Can I communicate it in a very smart way? Can I be succinct with it? Because they're looking at, countless pieces of information throughout the day, news pieces, market information, supply, demand. I'm just one component of that from the weather perspective. So I'm trying to be a little humble in thinking that like, I just can't just, throw tens or, dozens of pieces of information at them every day and think that somehow that becomes relevant, right? You have to know what's their sweet spot for what the product is that they're trading, right? And how important this weather might be. And that's more of, you just get experience of that over time, right? And that's how I said that, like, you get a really wide strike zone in a month like April, because you can kind of miss by a lot. And, no one's breathing down your neck over that. So, that wide strike zone doesn't exist when you get to like late May and June, right? Those weeks become much more important, just like they were important back in February.
Right.
I got to run here in a few minutes, Dave. If anyone has any questions, I have probably a minute or two to take another question.
Right.
I know there's a whole now we can get into the whole forecast piece, and I've alluded to that, I think, a little bit with maybe some of this potential MJO move, out here past, day 10, day 15, but I don't have time to really get into that too much.
Philip, Michael, you guys are any questions for Dave before he has to leave? I think you guys are on mute in case anyone's talking.
Nothing on my end.
I was gonna say, everyone, this is a weather day, which we should be having. Today should be class outside.
I know.
That's not.
Yeah.
There's a certain beautiful lethargy to like early April in the Mid-Atlantic when you get like a lot of days near 70. I kind of think like this is our little window into what people who live in San Diego experience all the time, which is, nights in the upper 40s to low 50s and days near 70. And if we could just throw a little morning fog in, which maybe we'll get the next few days when we get a bit of an east wind, that's perfect. That's coastal Southern California, 10 months of the year. So if there's disinterest to the subseasonal, it's because we're experiencing just really nice weather.
Hey, Philip, let me just put you on the hook for a second. Because you're graduate research scientist here. And I know you've looked at the subseasonal and MGO. Do you have any thoughts here in terms of when you think about what you've seen, even anecdotally with pattern changes and such, and what might telegraph some of those big pattern changes that we have or haven't talked about?
I guess in terms of pattern changes, I guess I'm shakier on like what exactly to look for to be like a big warning sign for pattern change. Now, something I did notice is looking at my forecast for 3 weeks ago, just in terms of that aspect, is that I noted that the teleconnections seem to be a neutral or maybe slightly below average signal, which I think ended up playing out when you look at what actually happened. I noticed. So I guess the warning signs for this past period were there, and it was just a question of how much you believed what signal. And I guess with the MJO signal, something like this, where you see like this sudden shift to a very strong amplitude, suggests to me that there might be some kind of pattern change, but that's also dependent on the fact that you believe what the model's actually showing here.
But to that point though, wouldn't that be interesting just to, or maybe it's just me, but just to catalog that, like to be able to define? Obviously, you have to do a couple of things. You have to define what you call a pattern change, right?
Uh-huh.
Dave brought up earlier that that there's going to be a little bit around the edges. Is it a 4 week? Is it a 2 week? But like define that. And then you can look back and say, to try to address your question, you just said, how many of those are associated? What percentage are associated with some sort of, again, this is a little bit subjective, but big MJO move, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then at least you would have some information on that. Then you have to still forecast it. You're right. But at least you would know, hey, 70%, I'm making this up, 70% of the big warmer pattern transitions in the last 30 years have been associated with an MJO greater than 2 standard deviations. So at least you know what to look for, right? Hey, that's on my radar. If I really think we're going to see a big MJO event, that could be the trigger mechanism. If we don't get that big MJO event, it's going to make it a lot less likely.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I guess the other issue is, as you said, does the February thing count as a pattern change, or does it count as just a blip in the general warmer pattern that we've had?
Yeah, and then that gets a little to statistics, right? You want to, it's a mixed thing, right? You want a decent sample size, right? If you go down, to 5 days, you're going to have too many events. And if you go up to maybe 5 weeks, you may not have enough, or 6 weeks. I don't know, but yeah, somewhere in there, right? And of course, you can test different lengths too. Maybe you do a few different things on a 3 week, on a 4 week, on a 6 week, and it'd be interesting to see how the signals change, the relationships change depending on the duration of the pattern. Cool. Okay. Well, Dave, do we need to let you go now?
Yeah, Dave, I have to run. I'm sorry. I'm a bit over, and I have a few other obligations here.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for joining us today. And it seems like, I think this could be a good time to end the meeting anyway, 5 minutes early, give folks a chance to go outside, right, and enjoy the weather. So
thanks, Dave. I appreciate it.
All right, we'll do it again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.